Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into a medical anomaly that is completely challenging everything we thought we knew about the hardest habit on Earth. Today, we're looking at how a single substance is dismantling nicotine addiction at the deepest neurological level. To really grasp the scale of the problem we're dealing with, we have to look at the devastating global death toll nicotine causes every single year. 8 million people. I mean, to put that into perspective, that's more than HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. It's a completely legal product consumed by over 1 billion people daily, and half of its lifetime users will literally die from its effects. It's just a staggering public health crisis. Now, for decades, our standard approach, nicotine replacement therapies like patches and gums, has yielded a relatively bleak 13% success rate at the 12-month mark. But a landmark study by a research team at Johns Hopkins found that psilocybin-assisted therapy produced an 80% verified quit rate in long-term smokers. We aren't looking at some marginal, incremental improvement here. This is an entirely different category of medical outcome. Part 1, the nicotine trap. Before we investigate how that incredible 80% success rate is actually possible, we need to understand the brutal neuroscience of why nicotine is so addictive. We got to look at what exactly it is we're trying to cure. When a smoker inhales, the drug's extreme speed creates this incredibly tight, almost unbreakable behavioral conditioning loop. Think about this. Nicotine reaches the central nervous system in just 10 seconds. That's faster than almost any other route of drug administration. It immediately binds to receptors and triggers a massive rush of dopamine right in the brain's primary reward hub. Because the reward hits so incredibly fast, your brain learns this behavioral association with terrifying efficiency. So the crucial point here is that dependence isn't a lack of willpower, right? It's neuroadaptation, physically changing your brain's architecture. Over time, your brain notices this constant flood of artificial dopamine, and to protect itself, it downregulates. It's kind of like turning down the volume on your stereo because the music is just way too loud. Your brain actively reduces its own natural dopamine production and desensitizes its receptors. The entire biological system recalibrates around the drug.
And because of that baseline shift, you quickly fall right into the withdrawal trap, where the drug has literally redefined your brain's sense of normal. When nicotine is absent, your dopamine levels plummet way below baseline. This creates intense dysphoria, anxiety, and just this overwhelming physical craving. At this stage of the addiction, you're no longer smoking to feel a pleasurable high. You're smoking simply to stop feeling terrible.
Add in environmental triggers, like, say, having your morning coffee, and you have these deeply wired responses firing straight into the amygdala. These are conditioned cravings that standard treatments honestly just cannot extinguish. It's deeply Pavlovian. The smell of smoke, the end of a meal, the drive to work, all these sensory cues get paired with that dopamine reward. So even if you slap on a nicotine patch to manage the chemical withdrawal, those heavily encoded cue reactivity patterns remain physically in your brain, just waiting to trigger a relapse months later. Part 2, the psilocybin breakthrough. Let's move over to the Johns Hopkins trials and see how an entirely new paradigm of addiction treatment targets this exact problem. I mean, how exactly does psilocybin break a neural circuit that is this entrenched? Well, we're going to break down 4 specific mechanisms of action that explain how a mushroom literally dismantles this addiction circuit. It's this fascinating multi-pronged attack on the brain's dependency architecture that goes so much deeper than just substituting one chemical for another. Mechanism 1 involves resetting the dopamine baseline. Psilocybin acts as a 5-HT2A agonist, which basically means it binds to specific serotonin receptors to flood the brain with plasticity, normalizing that damaged, downregulated dopamine system we talked about earlier. By activating these receptors, it triggers rapid synaptic remodeling. In short, it puts the brain into a state of heightened flexibility, allowing that depleted dopamine reward system to structurally reset itself back toward a healthy pre-addiction state. Which brings us to the default mode network, or DMN. This is the network where that stubborn I am a smoker identity actually lives. Think of the DMN as the part of your brain that runs your autobiographical story in the background. For a long-term user, smoking isn't just an action, is it? It's a core piece of their identity, heavily embedded in how they cope with stress, how they socialize, even how they structure their entire day.
So, moving to mechanism 2, silencing that smoker identity. Psilocybin temporarily suppresses this exact network, creating a vital window of psychological flexibility where that rigid identity can be completely rewritten. When the DMN goes quiet during a session, that rigid self-concept entirely loses its grip. It's like untangling a really tight knot, creating a space where patients can fundamentally reappraise who they are, completely separate from the addiction.
For mechanism 3, the drug enhances the prefrontal cortex, restoring top-down inhibitory control so you can actually say no to cravings. See, chronic nicotine use degrades your prefrontal function over time, which is why your impulsive subcortical brain usually wins the argument when a craving hits. But psilocybin increases synaptic density here, restoring your cognitive control. You actually regain the agency to just let a craving pass without acting on it. Finally, mechanism 4, fear extinction of nicotine cues. Elevated neuroplasticity allows the brain to extinguish those deeply Pavlovian, cue-triggered cravings for good. This is an absolute triumph over the relapse loop. This is where those morning coffee triggers are defeated. The heightened state of learning in the brain allows the person to form new, healthier memories that override the old conditioned responses, effectively wiping out the threat of environmental cues forever. Part 3. The clinical container. Now, it is absolutely critical to note that this isn't just about taking a pill in isolation. The environment is just as important as the pharmacology. You can't just administer the compound without the proper framework and expect an 80% success rate. Patients actually undergo a rigorous 15-week Hopkins protocol, proving that cognitive behavioral therapy and guided integration are what make the changes permanent. They spend 4 full weeks just in CBT preparation. The actual quit date is anchored right to their first psilocybin session in week 5. Then they spend weeks in integration therapy, actively consolidating the insights they gained. The therapy is what takes the drug's raw neuroplasticity and molds it into lasting behavior change. Having mapped out the biology and the clinical schedule, we are left with a really fascinating question. What actually drives the success? Because unlike a nicotine patch, which directly replaces the chemical, psilocybin is doing something remarkably different at the human level. Part 4, the mystical active ingredient. And the answer here is a complete plot twist, shifting our focus away from pure biology to a profound, pharmacologically facilitated philosophical event. Researchers found a direct dose-response relationship, but definitely not the kind you might expect. Having a complete mystical experience was a far stronger predictor of quitting than the physical drug dose itself. I mean, this is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding in modern addiction literature. The patients who experienced the most profound psychological peak, this deep sense of unity, meaning, and shifting values, were the ones most likely to stay smoke-free years later. The biology opens the door, sure, but the psychological experience is what actually walks through it. Patients reported, and I quote, a profound shift in perspective, a renewed sense of meaning and connection that made the temporary relief of a cigarette feel trivial by comparison. When psychological reorganization is this profound, the temporary dopamine hit of a cigarette just fundamentally stops mattering to the individual. It's no longer a battle of aggressively managing withdrawal symptoms. The desire is simply gone. Part 5, Beyond Nicotine. Let's zoom out to the broader implications here, because these results hint at something much, much larger than just smoking cessation. Because psilocybin works on the underlying architecture of addiction, trials are already showing it works on alcohol use disorder, with studies on opioids and cocaine underway right now. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway that nicotine hijacks is the exact same highway used by alcohol, stimulants, and even behavioral addictions like gambling. This isn't a drug that just cures smoking. It appears to be a therapy that targets the brain's core addiction architecture itself. We're looking at a true paradigm shift where we don't just manage the symptoms of addiction, but actually rewrite the entrenched neural pathways that sustain it. So if psilocybin can rewrite the architecture of nicotine addiction, literally the most fatal habit on the planet, what other impossible habits could we break? Think about the millions of lives that could be changed.